Right. I make that. I make that 10 to 4. Do you? 9 to 4. We're late. I'm so sorry. Well, some people might come, but we don't want to tacitly approve of tardiness, so we should press on. Okay, so the observant amongst you will have noticed that I'm not talking about what was on the programme, and I'm really sorry. When I just didn't want to anymore. So I'm talking about this instead, and I hope you'll find it interesting. But if you wanted the other thing and you want to leave, I completely understand. Right, okay, so Making Kids Cleverer, and that's the title of a book that I've just published in English, and I'm going to talk you through some of the arguments in that. So, first of all, the idea of the advantage gap. It's not real, is the first thing to say. It's not an absolute. That the problem with gaps is that we look at what people at the very top achieve and the people at the very bottom, and we obsess about those, and we forget the fact that everybody else is in the middle. The gap is where we all are. So that's the first thing to say. But it's also true to say this, that when we look at student achievement, the most significant factor, the factor that correlates most with how well children end up doing is their socioeconomic profile. And I'm going out on a limb and saying that's probably not something that we should be pleased about. We might think, well, that's inevitable, there's not much I can do, but I'm going to suggest that we shouldn't. Because the argument that I want to make is that the way schools tend to be structured systematically biases everything that happens in favour of those children who are already more privileged and against those who are less privileged. So that if you come from a background with a higher socioeconomic profile, that what happens in school is going to have less importance for you. That if you are academically successful, the school can take less credit for it. I mean, it's relatively easy and straightforward for children from higher socioeconomic profiles to do well. And it also means that if you're from a more disadvantaged background, then the impact of school is more powerful and significant. It's going to mean more. And so one of the things that we might infer from this is that school doesn't make nearly as much difference as perhaps it should. And that's something that maybe we should reflect on. But it isn't fate. It doesn't have to be that way. Or at least that's my claim, and you can have a think about whether or not what you think I'm saying is correct. So with that in mind, with that idea about the advantage gap and the caveats about it, I want to now make a claim that I hope you'll feel is uncontentious and that we can all get on board with and agree on. And it's about the purpose of education. And I'm going to claim that the purpose of education is that we should try and make people happier, healthier, safer, more creative, better at solving problems, and all that good stuff. That I've met very few people that don't think those things are important, but I don't want to make an assumption. Obviously, if you disagree with that, please feel free to say. So that's uncontroversial, but what's much more controversial, perhaps, is how do we get there? What are the things that are more or less likely to make that happen? And in thinking about that, one of the things that I've spent a lot of time reading about and trying to find out about is this concept of intelligence. Because we'll talk through some of the reasons why as we go. It looks like intelligence is a pretty important factor. But you might be wondering what it is, and I'm going to give this definition, which I think, as you can see from the length of it, is a bit messy. It's not a concept that lends itself to very short, pithy definitions. And what I like about this particular definition is that it tries to reflect something about everyday experience. It suggests that intelligence is about things that we all sort of value and recognise, even if we're not that concerned about academic ability. So this catching on, making sense and figuring out are all things that I think a definition of intelligence ought to capture. Does that sound okay? I mean, this isn't a consensus. There are definitely researchers in the field that take issue with this definition, but it's as close to a consensus statement as I've been able to find. So if you don't like it, you're not alone, but tough. So one of the interesting things, and there are all sorts of myths and misconceptions about intelligence, particularly about intelligence as measured by IQ tests. And so lots of people that I've spoken to and debated with are pretty squeamish about the idea of IQ. And I have to say, so am I. I've got all sorts of problems with IQ. And we have to be really clear and say that IQ and intelligence are definitely not the same. I think when thinking about intelligence, even though I've given you that definition, maybe it's fairest to say you know it when you see it. Kind of like the famous definition of pornography. You know it when you see it. You don't need to necessarily describe it. But IQ is just a number. It's a mathematical construct. It's an aggregate of performance on a series of subtests. And as a number, it's relatively meaningless. But one of the things that we tend to do as human beings is we see numbers and we start giving them almost magical properties. Because as soon as you get a number, you can start thinking about dividing it and multiplying it and turning it into a percentage, and it takes on a reality that it doesn't actually possess. So I want to make that clear. But the really interesting thing about IQ scores as a proxy for trying to measure intelligence of all of the imperfections that should allow is that contrary to public opinion, which is that the only thing that IQ scores measure is how well you do on an IQ test. Contrary to that view, IQ scores seem to correlate quite strongly with things that almost everybody values. And I'm just going to show you some of the correlations between IQ and other measures and other things. So I should say briefly about correlation. You can see we've got these numbers, 0.4, 0.7. A perfect correlation would be 1, and that never happens in an area like social psychology. You never get, the best that you ever get is around about 0.8. That's about as strong as it gets. And one of the interesting findings about IQ scores, were you to take an IQ test today and then take an IQ test next month, the correlation between those two scores that you got would be about 0.8. You wouldn't get a perfect replication of performance. So that when we look at this and we see some of those, we see there at the bottom that IQ correlates with educational outcomes so strongly, that's a really powerful and important finding. That when we give children IQ tests at the age of 11 and then look at academic performance at the age of 16, they're strongly predictive. They're not perfect. There is other stuff going on, which accounts for the why it isn't 1. But they have more predictive power than any other measure that we've yet to encounter. And if you look at some of those lower correlations, you look at a trait like creativity, whatever that is, or leadership, they're much smaller correlations, but they're far more than you would expect to find by chance. And as you all know, I'm sure, correlation is not causation. It could be that all of these things in separate ways are all causing higher IQ scores, Or it could be that there's some third factor that nobody's found out about that causes these things and IQ scores. But probability suggests, because we've got this arrow pointing in the same direction for so many factors, that it's likely to be that IQ scores are having a causal relationship with all of these other things. And I'll just talk you through just a couple of them, which are, so the conscientious one's interesting, and I've put there point 4 to point 6. That varies depending upon the environment you find yourself in. So if you find yourself in a high complexity occupation, an occupation where all sorts of decision making and problem solving are involved, a bit like teaching, then your IQ score has more predictive power, and that accounts for the 0.6. The 0.4 is for a low complexity occupation. And what that suggests is the higher your IQ score, the more likely you are to turn up and do a decent job, which is interesting and maybe not what we'd expect. The one below that about violence, again, I've got a little spread there. And so what that suggests is that the higher your IQ score, the less likely you are to be the victim of violent crime. And maybe that has something to do, with your increased ability to talk your way out of a difficult situation or avoid it completely. The other end of the spread, the 0.6, is about the fact that the higher your IQ score, the less likely you are to commit a violent crime. You might commit all sorts of other crimes, but less likely to be violent ones. Happiness is really interesting. There's a general perception that people with high IQs are miserable. And this isn't true. I mean, happiness is very, very hard to judge. And the way this particular correlation is drawn by looking at self-reports of happiness, basically asking people, are you happy? And self-reports are notoriously unreliable. But even so, people who have higher IQs report feeling happier, which is maybe not what you'd expect. And again, contrary to expectations, people with higher IQs tend to enjoy better mental health. And there's again a common misconception that if you have a high IQ, you're likely to be some sort of morose, suicidal figure who's probably bonkers in some way. And there's no evidence to support that. The contrary is true, it would appear. And there's a lot of data, particularly, I've put in brackets there, schizophrenia. That's not to say you're more likely to get schizophrenia. The kind of finding with the schizophrenia is that the higher your IQ, the less severe the symptoms of schizophrenia that you're likely to present, which again is interesting and perhaps surprising. And then you've got longevity, so the more intelligent you are, the inference here is the longer you will live. And maybe that's because you'll make less foolish decisions, you'll eat more wisely, you'll exercise more perhaps, who knows. And then we've got this really, really strong one with educational outcomes. And I think a really important and open question here is IQ causing the educational outcomes, or are the educational outcomes causing IQ? And I'm going to explore the two ways round that might be. There are very few negatives when we look at the relationship between IQ and other things. One of the very few that's been found is an increased tendency to wear glasses. So those of you that are wearing glasses, I know you'll now be feeling rather smug, but you have to accept there's a perfectly reasonable possibility that you could be wearing glasses and be stupid. So don't be too smug. So the pressing question, if all of these things, they don't have to be true, they just have to be probable. If it's more probable that people with higher IQs enjoy all these benefits, the question we have to ask is it possible to make people cleverer, to make children cleverer? Is it possible to do that? And one of the popular ideas at the moment, and some of you might have gone to Casper's talk earlier in the day, is to consider growth mindset, and the idea that within there that you're as clever as you think you are. If you believe you can be more intelligent, you will be. And the idea that the brain is like a muscle. The brain is not like a muscle. In a very real sense, it's not like a muscle. A muscle is something that contracts and expands. Your brain doesn't do that. If you grew your brain, you'd have a problem because your skull obviously doesn't grow. That would create all sorts of difficulties for you. But even in a figurative sense, even in a metaphorical sense, it's not true, because when you use a muscle, like let's imagine we were using our leg muscles and we wanted to do some leg exercise. Let's say I started doing some squats. Oh, sorry, I'll stop that. That was possibly disturbing. If I do squat exercises, the muscles in my legs become better at everything that I use my legs for. I'd be more likely to be faster at running. I could run for longer. I could jump higher, and all of those good things. Exercising your brain doesn't work like that. I don't know if any of you... Do any of you remember brain training games? Do you remember those? They were very popular on Nintendos and that sort of thing. Broadly, the finding on research into brain training games is that if you play brain training games, you get better at brain training games, which is nice. It doesn't transfer to anything else. You don't get better at any other thing, which was the belief, which was the reason for doing them. If you practice a particular cognitive ability, you get better at that cognitive ability, but you don't get better at any other cognitive ability. So in that in that sense, the brain isn't like a muscle either. So if we're sceptical about some of those claims, is there any basis of thinking we can make kids cleverer? And to think about that more, I want to introduce this concept that was first posited by a researcher called Raymond Cattell in the 60s. And he talked about the fact that intelligence has these two qualities of being fluid and being crystallized. And slightly counterintuitively, the fluid bit is fixed, or not quite fixed. What happens is it increases during your life until you're in your mid-20s, and then it starts to hemorrhage. And from the mid-20s onwards, you're losing fluid intelligence. But the finding is we can't really seem to increase anybody's fluid intelligence. So beyond that curve that you have within your own life as you mature and then age, you can't get more than you've got. But crystallized intelligence, so fluid intelligence is your raw reasoning ability. That if you know nothing about a subject and nothing about a problem, it's the likelihood that you would be able to solve that problem. Crystallized intelligence is your ability to use what you know to solve problems. And that increases throughout your life. That carries on increasing as you learn more about the world. So it really is true that the older you are, the wiser you become. I mean, not, on average. Maybe there are a few people that's not true of. But for most of us, that our elders have more crystallized intelligence, and in that sense are cleverer. So I think this is a useful area to look at, because it suggests to us, stop wasting time with the fluid aspects of intelligence, the things that don't really seem to respond to interventions. And I should say, there are people that disagree with me on this, but broadly, the finding from research into trying to increase fluid intelligence is every now and again somebody will publish some paper saying that they've managed to do it, and then almost immediately somebody comes and unpicks their research and say, no, it doesn't actually work. But for us as teachers, the important part of this is nothing that anyone's turned up so far can have an impact in the classroom. They're very, very specialised mechanisms that people are claiming might be able to increase fluid intelligence, but not at all reliably. And so it would not be profitable for you to spend your time trying to do those things. You'd be much better off trying to increase children's crystallised intelligence, because that is pretty easy. It's well understood. If you show people more things, if you tell them more things, if you give them more experiences, they learn more, thereby increasing their crystallized intelligence. That's where I'm suggesting we should expend our resources. So here's my claim, that by increasing the quality and the quantity of what children know, we make them cleverer and therefore more likely to be happy, healthy and safe. That's my claim. And I'm also going to claim that the most important difference between the children who find themselves in your classrooms is the quality and the quantity of what they know. There are, of course, all sorts of differences, but most of the differences between children are not ones you can do anything about. They're not really malleable. But the quantity and the quality of what they know is highly malleable. It's relatively easy to change. And that's why I think it's the most important difference. Does that make sense? Okay. So briefly, I'm not going to talk about this in any detail, but I think it's useful to make sense of where we're going, that it's worth having at least this really basic understanding of how we seem to learn. There seems to be this freeway interaction between the environment, which is outside of us, and these two components of memory, working in long-term memory. I should say, looking at that, I don't want any of you to make the mistake of thinking that's true. It isn't true. It's a model. It's a way of thinking about how we learn. And all models are necessarily inaccurate. Models are simplifications of reality. But some models, despite the fact that they're wrong, are useful. And this is a model which allows us to make very useful predictions and inferences. So whilst it's not true, it's useful. So, and so working memory is where we think. All of the thinking you do, all of your attention takes place within this area that's called working memory. So you pay attention to the environment. The environment at the moment's me, talking, showing you pictures. But it's also whether or not you need to go to the loo. It's whether you had too much semla in the break and are feeling a bit stuffed. Maybe it's the rather alluring smell of the person sitting next to you. All of these things make up your environment, and you can't pay attention to everything. You can only pay attention to some of what's going on because there's relatively limited space. But as you're paying attention, not only are you learning and remembering the things that you're paying attention to, you're also remembering and making use of things that you already know. And you might well be having the experience that as I say something, it makes you think, oh, yeah, I've heard something like that before, or that makes me think about. And that's a very useful process, because whenever we do that, whenever we respond to a prompt and it triggers a memory, that helps us to make sense of the new information. Because the way our memory is context dependent. So if I say bread, you say sandwiches. Okay, or butter or toast, but sandwich is clearly at the forefront of somebody's mind there. And so long-term memory is a difficult concept because nobody has the ability to introspect their own long-term memory. The minute we try to, we're still operating in working memory. We know it exists because you can think about something and then stop thinking about it and then think about it again a bit later. And it must go somewhere. It must park. And we're calling that long-term memory. I don't know if any of you do any of you recognize the image that I've chosen for long-term memory there? Well done, good knowledge, sir. Yes, it's a scene from the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, and as I'm sure you all know, Indiana Jones has brought the Ark of the Covenant back to America, and the US government have taken it away from him, and they said, we're going to keep it in a safe place. And what they do, they nail it into a wooden crate. They mark the crate top secret, and they store it in a warehouse full of crates marked top secret. It's safe, but nobody will ever find it. And that's a bit like some of the things in your memory. They're in there, but you have no access to them. And one of the theories for how this works is schema acquisition. And when you only know one thing about a subject, it's very hard for us to recall it because, as I said, our memory works on prompts. So the likelihood that you'll get the right prompt in the environment to trigger a particular memory is relatively small when you only know one thing. I'll show you, we'll talk you through how this might work. What I'm going to do is I'm now going to teach you an item of vocabulary from a different language, which I'm hoping that some of you know and some of you don't know. So the word that I'm going to teach you, the phrase, is ni hao. Don't say anything. Okay. Put your hand up if you know what that means. Great, thank you. I might come to you in a second. Put your hand up if you don't know what that means. Perfect. Okay. So, if you don't know what that means, which is currently the state that you have in your long-term memory, you just have that sound. It doesn't mean much to you. If I was to come back in a week's time and say, what was the phrase that I taught you, my prediction would be that you'd really struggle to remember. You could, but it would be relatively unlikely. But you have stored that sound information with its meaning, haven't you? Do you want to say what it means? Excellent. It means hello. How are you? It's literally in Mandarin Chinese, yes. So in your long-term memory now, that has happened. That the sound ni hao has been linked to the semantic information that it means hello in Mandarin. And that's increased the likelihood that you can remember it in the future, because there are two components that are stored together. If I was to continue teaching Mandarin vocabulary, I'm not. That's it. I'm sorry. That's another session. Then each item of Mandarin vocabulary would make it easier for you to remember every other item. The more Mandarin you know, the easier it is to remember all the Mandarin you know. And as you know with language, eventually you reach a point of fluency, and it turns out that if you're fluent in Mandarin, you never ever forget ni hao. You never get Chinese people bumping each other in Beijing and going, oh, there's a word that you say, I don't know what it is. In the same way that in Sweden, nobody ever forgets how to say, hey! You just do it. And we do this sort of thing automatically. When we become fluent, we communicate without engaging our brains. You might have had this experience. Have you ever had this where it's your birthday and somebody says to you, happy birthday, and you say, yeah, you too. And then you think, oh, that didn't make sense. It's not actually. And we've spoken before. Our fluency is such that we speak without conscious thought. And that's important. The more we know, the more interconnected these schema, these networks of information are, the more space we have in our working memory to think about new things. And if we reach the point of automaticity with something, then we find it relatively easy to think about, draw that as a complete piece, or it not take up any space at all. So, I'm just going to talk you through now why knowing things matters. Broadly, the claim that I'm making, just to keep you up to date here, is that knowing things increases your crystallized intelligence, which is likely to make you happier, healthier, and safer, more prosperous, and wear glasses. So, why does it matter? The ability to think depends upon knowing things. And we know this because nobody can think about something that they don't know anything about. Give it a go. Try and think of something that you have absolutely no awareness of. You can't do it. You can think about things you don't know much about, and you can say, for instance, I don't know much about quantum physics, and you can, that's a bit tedious and limiting, but you can do that, but you literally cannot think about something that you don't know anything about. So the ability to think depends on knowing things. And the claim now that I'm making is that the more things you know, the better the quality of thought you're going to be capable of. The more things you know, the more likely you are to see connections and to think, I could apply this here, or that's a bit like that. And you think more interesting thoughts the more you know. And I'm going to repeat this because I think it's important. The most important difference between children in our classrooms, and it's the most important because it's the one we can do most about, is what they know. Right. So some of the counter-arguments, some of the things that people say in response to some of these ideas is to say, well, look, we're living in the 21st century, we've got the internet, it's packed full of stuff, you can just look stuff up whenever you need to. What's the point in cramming it into your long-term memory? Why would you do that? Why burden yourself with that? And that makes a certain amount of sense, and I definitely want to say that the internet and books are great, and they're a huge source of knowledge and a boon, but what's on the internet and what's in books, I'm going to call that information. And I'm going to say that knowledge is only knowledge if it's in your long-term memory, in your brain. Because, as we said, we can't think about things that we don't know. You can't think about the things on the internet that you haven't looked up. You can only think about the things that you know. So knowledge, in this way of thinking, is a function of organic tissue. The internet and books are storage devices for things that you may or may not ever know. They're useful, but they don't supplant. Knowing where to find something is a very pale substitute for actually knowing it. You can think about, I could look this up if I want to, but that's very limiting. Being able to think about the thing itself is much more interesting. So I want to show you give you a few examples of how knowledge makes everything more straightforward and easy. And to do that, I'm just going to briefly, with your permission, give you a quick test of your working memory. And to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a string of 12 numbers for 5 seconds. And if you can be bothered, you can try and remember them. You up for this? Okay, 5 seconds starting now. Nope. How do we do? Does anyone want to have a go at this? Where are, yeah, go on. What are you saying? Well, you're kind of, you're not bad. Does anyone else want to have a go? Yes, sir. Yeah. 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 Oh, round of applause. Very good. Now, what I think you did there, tell me if I'm wrong, is that you chunked those into groups of 3. And it turns out that the number 601 takes up about the same space as the number 6. It certainly takes up less space than the number 6, the number 0, and the number 1 separately. I did this recently with a group of teachers in a school in London, and they all got it right straight away. And I said, how did you do that? And they said, that's the numbers of our local bus routes. And there's an insight there, because what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you the same task. I'm going to show you the same numbers, but in a different order. But this time, all of you are going, many of you are going to find this really easy. Are you ready? And it's easy if those numbers have relevance for you. Now, if you're English, those numbers will have perhaps more relevance. If you're Swedish, you could maybe be forgiven for not remembering, for instance, that 1066 is the Battle of Hastings, and maybe you can picture Harold getting an arrow in the eye. 1812, you can maybe hear cannon fire going off. 1966, you've got Bobby Charlton, something happened, didn't they? I think England did something good. I don't know what it, anyway. And because those things have relevance, because you know something about the way those numbers are presented, it makes the task easier. Let me show you a more everyday example. If you look at that sentence, it's really difficult to understand. And that's because I've put some of the words, I forget which language now, I think it's Montenegrin, which you might not know, which will probably be making that a real challenge for you to make sense. But look how easy it becomes to understand that sentence when you know what's going on. And as educators, you probably know who the OECD are and what PISA means and the rest of it. And suddenly it becomes trivial. Suddenly it's become easier. Not knowing things makes performing any kind of task that's relevant to what you know easier. It also governs how you see the world. I'm going to show you an image now, and based upon what you know, you will be able to see slightly different things. Some of you, most of you, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say everybody is recognizing that as a football match. So I think you'll all be able to recognize that there are two different teams. Some of you, though, will have quite sophisticated knowledge of football and might be able to recognize a particular tactic being employed. Does anyone want to say what tactic they... Yes, sir. The offside trap. Now, if you don't know what the offside trap is, you can't see it because you don't know what it is. It governs, what you know governs how you interact with the world. So I've made a claim there that knowing more is likely to make children cleverer because it increases their crystallized intelligence and therefore will make more likely to make them happier, healthier and safer and more prosperous and all of those things that we like. I'm just going to briefly discuss the idea of what it is that maybe we should be teaching them. And this is, I think, an important discussion because we can't teach children everything. We can't do that because time is finite. Curriculum time is finite in particular. I listened to Ben Newmark telling us this morning that children are only in our classrooms for about 9% of the years they spend in school. We've got very limited time to teach them things, so we have to make choices. So I'm going to suggest to you that while you can make an argument that all knowledge is precious, whether or not it's useful, some knowledge is more useful than others. Some allows you to do more interesting things than other knowledge. Some allows better quality of thought than others. And this is a discussion to which you might want to give some thought and spend some time on. But the point is that for us as educators, as us deciding what we're going to teach, we have to make choices, and there is always an opportunity cost. If we choose to do one thing, we cannot also choose to do something else at the same time. Once time is spent, it's gone. And what we rarely do is think, what we normally do is to say, well, this is what I chose to do, and it seemed fine. It seems pretty good. And what I think we ought to do instead is to say, well, hang on a second, is the thing that we chose to do more or less good than the thing we didn't choose to do? And I don't think we do that enough. So one idea that I think is useful is this concept, a concept called powerful knowledge. And I'm just going to talk you through what powerful knowledge might mean. So there's a distinction made between knowing everyday things and knowing things which allow you to think more deeply about things. I'm just going to speed up here because I realise we're pretty much at the end. But these are the sorts of things that allow you that allow us to think that things might be more powerful. Basically, if knowing something causes you to ask interesting questions and explain things in new ways, it probably has power and is worth teaching. And we'll gloss over a few other things, but that's one area to concentrate. So some of you might remember back in the late 80s, early 90s, a very controversial book was published called The Bell Curve, which said basically there's no hope, there's no chance, that people on the wrong end of the distribution are never going to get cleverer, really, in any appreciable sense, and we might as well not bother. And it was, it was very controversial, and you may or may not agree with it. But what I want to think about as a thought experiment is to think about, if we were to make all children cleverer, if we were to try and move the entire bell curve to the right, who would benefit most? And what I want to suggest, here's our bell curve. What I want to suggest is that whilst this is where we really need to separate IQ and intelligence. Remember, IQ is just a number. Intelligence, particularly crystallized intelligence, represents knowledge, represents the ability to use knowledge in particular ways. So if we increase the amount of crystallized intelligence that all children have, whatever their background, who benefits most? And to help us think about who benefits most, let's substitute for a moment intelligence with wealth. So intelligence distributes normally in a bell curve like that. Wealth doesn't. Wealth is an asymmetric distribution. Some people, it does this. It doesn't come down again. Now, if you gave everybody, let's say we gave everybody in Sweden 10,000 kroner, who would benefit most from us doing that? The richest or the poorest? For the richest, it would make no difference whatsoever. The poorest, that has the potential perhaps to be life-changing. Now, if we think about intelligence in the same way, if we think about it being the gift of knowledge, and we give all children knowledge in the belief and the expectation that it might make them cleverer, that the people on the right of the distribution, it doesn't really make much difference to, but the people on the left, it could be life-changing. It could allow them to do things which would be impossible otherwise. And that's where I think we should think that yes, the rich will get richer, but the fact that the poor get richer too is much more important and makes much more difference. Just to summarise, these are the things that I hope you'll take away and remember, that this is a social justice argument. If we prioritise particular types of knowledge, the children have greater opportunity. Having good intentions aren't enough. Currently, my claim is we have a systematic bias in favour of the most privileged and against the most disadvantaged. I don't think that's right or fair or acceptable, and that we should seek to think differently about those things. I hope that you found some of that interesting and useful. If you didn't, I'm really sorry. I tried my best. Thank you.